The mistaken stop. The heat shimmered off the California asphalt as the late afternoon sun bore down on the freeway. Sundar Pichai, CEO of one of the world's most powerful tech companies, had decided to take a rare break from back-to-back meetings and interviews. He was heading to a quiet retreat outside Palo Alto, where he could disconnect for a few hours and recharge. Driving alone in a nondescript navy blue electric car, he wore a simple gray polo and jeans. No security, no assistance, just him and the road. He liked moments like these, moments that reminded him of who he was before the world knew his name. As the Tesla hummed quietly down the freeway, Sundar reflected on the journey from a modest home in Chennai, India, to the helm of Silicon Valley. It hadn't been easy. There were days he questioned if he belonged in the rooms where decisions shaping the world were made. Yet here he was, a living testament to what belief, grit, and integrity could build. Just as he was passing through a quiet suburban area, the sharp flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. "That's odd," he muttered. He glanced down. Speed limit adhered to. Signals used. Car registered. Nothing out of place. He pulled over calmly, lowering his window. A white police officer stepped out of the patrol car, stiff-backed and stern-faced. Mid-40s, buzz cut, sunglasses, and a jaw set like a steel trap. The officer approached with caution. "License and registration," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Sundar offered a polite nod. "Of course, officer. May I ask what this is about?" The officer didn't respond. Instead, he peered into the car, scanning it quickly. There was nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, but something about Sundar, his skin, his accent, his calm demeanor, seemed to trigger something else. "Whose car is this?" the officer asked sharply. "It's mine," Sundar said, handing over his license, "registered under my name." The officer examined the ID, then narrowed his eyes. "Where are you heading?" "A private retreat near Menlo Park, just taking the evening to unwind." The officer scoffed lightly. "Fancy car. Fancy area. Lot of tech people live up there." Sundar stayed quiet. He'd had his share of moments like this. Some subtle, some overt. All reminders of how perception can shape reality in an instant. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer said, hand inching toward the holster. Sundar's brow furrowed. "May I ask why, officer?" "No sudden moves." "I'm not making any," Sundar said, his voice even, peaceful, not out of fear, but principle. The officer gestured again. "Step out. Now." Sundar did as asked, moving slowly, carefully. The officer walked him to the side of the road. Another police unit arrived, called in as backup. Now there were two officers, two white men, one man of Indian origin, standing in silence, his hands at his sides. As the second officer began checking Sundar's plates, the first one paced. Tension thickened in the air. "What do you do for work?" the first officer asked. Sundar tilted his head slightly. "I work in technology." "That vague, huh?" "I oversee a few projects," he added, resisting the urge to name-drop himself. Just then, the second officer called out, "Hey, I just ran the plates and the license. Do you know who this is?" The first officer looked confused. "No. What are you talking about?" "Dude, that's Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google, Alphabet, the whole thing." There was a long pause. The silence was deafening. The first officer turned back to Sundar, eyes wide and conflicted. The color drained from his face. It was like he'd just realized he had pulled over the president, or someone close. You're that Sundar." Sundar gave a polite, calm nod. "Yes." The officer took a step back, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. I didn't realize. I'm sorry. You just looked." Sundar didn't flinch. He simply asked, "Would you have treated me differently if I looked like you?" The question hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The officer looked away. Sundar continued, his voice low but resolute. You didn't ask me about my driving. You asked me where I was going, who I was, if I belonged. You made a decision before I even spoke. The second officer, clearly uncomfortable, nodded slowly. I think we're done here. Sundar turned toward his car, pausing just long enough to say one more thing. Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. He drove off, leaving behind a silence louder than any siren. Echoes of truth. The echo of Sundar's words lingered long after the car disappeared into the sunlit horizon. Officer Daniel Brooks stood motionless on the shoulder of the road, the warm California breeze brushing against his uniform. The traffic had resumed its lazy afternoon rhythm, yet he felt trapped in a silent whirlwind of his own making. He had been a police officer for 17 years, a man who prided himself on being fair, on being just. He often told himself he didn't see color, only behavior. But today, something inside him cracked. It wasn't just the public humiliation of stopping one of the world's most respected men. It was the realization that despite years of telling himself otherwise, bias had whispered in his ear before he'd even approached the vehicle. He had reacted to a man's appearance before hearing a word he said. And in doing so, he had betrayed not only the dignity of that man, but the oath he'd taken to uphold justice without prejudice. He sat in the cruiser long after the backup unit had gone, unable to shake the weight of what had happened. The dashboard lights blinked rhythmically, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the encounter in his head like a film looped endlessly. He remembered the calm in Sundar's eyes, not a flicker of fear, only disappointment. The quiet disappointment of a man too familiar with being questioned, even when he had long proven himself. That expression was what haunted Daniel the most. It wasn't rage or insult. It was a seasoned weariness, like a man who had seen too many doors close before they opened. Too many heads turn when he walked into rooms he had every right to be in. That kind of disappointment wasn't born in a single moment. It came from a lifetime of navigating silent ceilings and invisible fences. Driving back to the station, Daniel felt like a stranger behind the wheel. The road he'd driven 1,000 times suddenly seemed unfamiliar, like it no longer belonged to him. That evening, he didn't speak much to his wife or teenage son. The house was filled with the muted sounds of life, the faint buzz of a sports channel, the clink of silverware at dinner. But Daniel's thoughts were miles away. He found himself opening his laptop late at night, typing in a name he barely acknowledged hours earlier. Sundar Pichai. The search results were staggering. Articles, interviews, speeches, even documentaries. There was a video from a college graduation where Sundar spoke about his journey, standing at the podium in front of thousands, his voice humble, his words profound. Daniel watched in silence as Sundar spoke of sharing a one-room apartment with his family in Chennai, of using payphones to communicate, of dreaming in a world where the internet was a luxury. And now, this man led one of the largest tech empires on the planet. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his heart heavy. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just hours ago, he had spoken to this same man on the side of the road like he was suspicious for simply existing in a certain zip code, for driving a certain kind of car. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a moment of unmasking. A moment where the shield of authority had failed to protect what it was supposed to: dignity, equality, and truth. And it was a moment Daniel knew he couldn't ignore. For days after the incident, Daniel found himself navigating a haze of introspection. Every time he passed someone on patrol, someone who didn't look like him, he wondered what unspoken narratives lay behind his own gaze. He noticed things he hadn't before. The way some people stiffened when he walked into a store in uniform, the subtle tension when he knocked on certain doors. And then he began to realize that policing was not just about enforcement, but about presence, about the message conveyed even in silence, even in posture. He had always thought of himself as one of the good ones, but now he questioned what that even meant if good intentions were cloaked in unconscious bias. He made a decision. It wasn't prompted by PR pressure or disciplinary threats. There hadn't even been a formal complaint. Sundar had driven away in silence. No headlines followed. No viral videos. But Daniel knew that silence wasn't peace. It was the quiet of someone too tired to fight yet another battle. And he owed it to that silence to change. He began with something simple. He drafted an email, not to defend himself, not to justify, but to apologize. He addressed it directly to Sundar's office at Alphabet. It read, "Mr. Pichai, my name is Daniel Brooks. I'm the officer who pulled you over last week. I now realize the mistake I made, and I want to sincerely apologize. Not just for the stop, but for the way I approached you. For allowing unconscious bias to shape my actions. You showed me dignity when I offered you doubt. Your words stayed with me. They've changed me. I don't expect a response. But I wanted you to know that I heard you. I truly heard you. And I am committed to doing better, not just for myself, but for every person I serve." Officer D. Brooks. He sent it, not knowing if it would ever reach Sundar, or if it would be lost in the flood of messages someone of his stature receives daily. But the act of writing it, of naming the failure, felt like a small yet necessary reckoning. Meanwhile, Sundar, back in the rhythm of meetings and strategy sessions, sat in his office overlooking the Palo Alto skyline. The encounter with the officer had unsettled him, but not for the reasons one might expect. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was tired. Tired of having to carry two faces, one for the boardroom, and one for the world that still asked if he belonged in the car he drove or the seat he occupied. But he was also resilient. That's the part the world often forgot. That every time someone like him was doubted, it didn't weaken them. It sharpened them. When Sundar received the email, his assistant initially flagged it as a general message. But when he read it, a long silence fell over his usually composed expression. He read it again. And then a third time. It was rare for someone in law enforcement to admit wrong without external pressure. And it reminded Sundar that change didn't always arrive with grand declarations. Sometimes it arrived in quiet confessions, in simple acts of humility. He thought long about how to respond. He didn't want to shame the man, nor did he want to become a symbol of something he never chose. But then he thought of his children, of the kind of world he wanted them to grow up in. He replied with a short but heartfelt message. "Officer Brooks, thank you for your words. It takes strength to admit when we fall short. I hope your story becomes an example to others. I hold no resentment. Only hope that more people in positions of power will have the courage to reflect as you have. With respect, Sundar Pichai." It was the beginning of something neither of them fully anticipated. One encounter, one mistake, and one letter, spiraling into a movement neither man had planned, but both would come to embrace. The ripple becomes a wave. The days that followed were unlike anything Officer Daniel Brooks had ever experienced in his 17-year career. His email exchange with Sundar Pichai had not been intended for public eyes, but as fate often dictates, the most sincere acts often find the most unexpected audiences. It began with a quiet mention in a blog post. A friend of Sundar's, moved by the exchange, shared the redemptive story anonymously. That post was picked up by a human interest columnist. From there, it traveled through the arteries of the internet, not with the fury of outrage, but with the slow, steady rhythm of something far rarer. Redemption. The post didn't name either man at first, but the details were unmistakable. And soon, someone connected the dots. By the end of the week, major news outlets were reaching out to both parties for comment. At the precinct, the atmosphere shifted like a cold front moving through familiar skies. Daniel's inbox flooded with messages, some filled with unexpected gratitude, others thick with judgment. A few officers congratulated him quietly, saying it took guts to admit fault. Others scoffed, whispering in corners, questioning his loyalty, accusing him of betraying the brotherhood by airing what they called unnecessary self-criticism. One even cornered him near the locker room and sneered, "So what? You're a hero now for calling yourself a racist." Daniel didn't flinch. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be honest. And for the first time in his career, he realized those were not always the same thing. But Daniel wasn't the only one changed by the spotlight. Sundar Pichai, normally reserved, cautious with public reactions, found himself at a strange crossroads. As CEO of one of the most influential companies in the world, he was no stranger to attention. But this was different. This wasn't about market share or product launches. It was about identity, about visibility and vulnerability. He received messages from parents, activists, teachers, immigrants, each touched by the quiet dignity with which he'd handled the encounter. Some praised his calm. Others lamented that he'd had to be calm at all. But more than anything, they urged him to speak, to take this private story and turn it into something public, something powerful. At first, Sundar hesitated. He was a technologist, not a preacher. He believed in algorithms and quiet innovation, not podiums and microphones. But then he thought of the thousands of young professionals who looked like him, who might be sitting in job interviews or boardrooms or crosswalks wondering if they belonged. He thought of his own journey, not as a CEO, but as a son, a young boy in India walking miles with his father to make a single long-distance phone call because they couldn't afford a phone at home. He thought of the moments he'd swallowed his voice just to avoid conflict, to make others comfortable, to survive spaces never built for him. And then he realized, maybe this wasn't about being loud. Maybe it was about being clear. So, he agreed to one interview, just one. A televised conversation with a respected journalist, known for cutting through noise and reaching into the soul of a story. The broadcast was watched by millions, but it didn't feel like a spectacle. It felt like a man telling the truth in the plainest way possible. In that interview, Sundar didn't vilify Officer Brooks. He didn't paint himself as a victim. Instead, he told the story as it happened. He recounted the moment of the stop, the tension in the air, the questions about belonging. But more importantly, he focused on what happened next. The email, the apology, the choice to change. "What struck me most," Sundar said during the interview, his hands folded calmly in his lap, "was not that I was pulled over. That happens. What struck me was that someone in a position of power chose to examine their power. That doesn't happen often." The words resonated far beyond the studio. Online forums buzzed with discussions not about blame, but about accountability. Leadership seminars shared clips of the interview. Police academies began mentioning the story in training modules. Universities invited both men to speak on ethics and courage. And through it all, something remarkable began to take shape. A narrative that wasn't about guilt, but about growth. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. Back in Daniel's precinct, the resistance began to solidify. There were no official reprimands, but the silence in the room spoke louder than any memo. He was left out of patrol schedules. His requests for community outreach projects were quietly denied. One morning, he found his locker defaced with the words "traitor" etched in black marker across the door. He stared at it for a long time, then calmly cleaned it off without a word. He understood now what real courage meant. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it and keep moving anyway. Despite the backlash, Daniel leaned into his transformation. He started attending public forums on racial bias in policing, often as the only uniformed officer in the room. He signed up for a restorative justice seminar, sitting beside people who had long distrusted law enforcement. At one event, a teenage boy, no older than Daniel's own son, asked him point-blank, "Why should we trust you now?" Daniel paused before answering. "You shouldn't, not just because I say so. Trust isn't a gift. It's earned, and I plan to earn it every single day I wear this badge." Meanwhile, Sundar found himself thinking about impact in new ways. He had always believed in technology as a tool for progress, but this experience reminded him that progress without humanity was hollow. He began funding scholarships for students from underrepresented communities to pursue careers in law, ethics, and public policy. He quietly met with police reform advocates, not to create division, but to listen, to understand, to offer support, not with press releases or cameras, but with presence. One afternoon, Sundar received an invitation he hadn't expected, an offer to speak at the same precinct where Officer Brooks worked. It came not from the department itself, but from a small group of young officers who had been inspired by the story. They wanted to hear from him directly, to ask questions, to understand how someone in his position could still face moments of invisibility, and how they could ensure fewer people did. Sundar accepted. That day, he walked into the precinct not as a tech executive, but as a man. He stood in front of a room filled with uniforms and uncertainty, and began not with criticism, but with a story. His story. He spoke of growing up in India, of arriving in America with a scholarship and a suitcase, of building a life where nothing was promised except the chance to try. And then he spoke of the stop, not with bitterness, but with truth. "This isn't about one bad cop," he said, looking around the room. "This is about the culture we all create, one moment at a time. You have more power than you realize. What you do in 10 seconds can shape how someone sees the law, and themselves, for a lifetime." The room was still when he finished. Some looked away. Others nodded slowly. Officer Brooks stood near the back, his eyes shining not with shame, but with resolve. In the months that followed, changes began to unfold. Quietly at first, then with greater momentum. The department introduced new training modules on bias and empathy. Officers were encouraged to engage in community service programs. Daniel was asked to help develop a mentorship initiative for new recruits, emphasizing emotional intelligence as much as physical preparedness. The story of a mistaken stop had become a blueprint for something larger. And yet, the most profound change was not procedural. It was personal. It was in the way Officer Brooks began to see the people he served, and in the way Sundar began to understand the power of his voice beyond the tech world. It was in every small choice they made, each act of listening, of learning, of leading with humility. What had started as a moment of misunderstanding had become a movement of understanding, and it was only just beginning. The weight of the spotlight. By the time spring arrived in California, the story of Officer Daniel Brooks and Sundar Pichai had matured beyond a media moment. What began as a quiet apology had transformed into something neither man had fully anticipated. A national conversation carried not by outrage, but by the rare breath of mutual respect and accountability. Universities invited both men to sit on panels about ethical leadership. Police departments across several states asked Officer Brooks to help them reimagine community engagement. And while the story was celebrated in progressive spaces, it was also dissected in polarizing forums, debated on talk radio, and twisted into soundbites by commentators who sought controversy where there had only been reflection. For Sundar, the attention was a strange and sometimes uncomfortable spotlight. He had never wanted to become a symbol of racial profiling, nor a representative of minority perseverance in a system that too often overlooked it. He had long believed in change through systems, through the silent, steady reform of internal processes, hiring decisions, scholarship programs, and data-driven policy recommendations. But now, the world wanted to hear from him about something deeper, more human, about fear, bias, and the quiet armor people of color wore every day in spaces where they weren't expected to succeed. There were moments when Sundar wanted to retreat into the safety of his boardrooms and algorithms, to let the storm pass. But each day, as messages continued to flood his inbox, some filled with gratitude, others brimming with desperation, he realized he no longer had that luxury. He had been granted a platform most could only dream of, and with it came a choice. He could remain a quiet example of success, or he could speak, gently but firmly, to the forces that shaped not just his journey, but the barriers so many others still faced. He chose to speak, not in fiery press conferences or impassioned social media posts, but in careful, deliberate forums. He began to collaborate with legal scholars, policymakers, and civil rights advocates on how to leverage technology for justice, not just efficiency. Facial recognition biases, predictive policing algorithms, surveillance in marginalized communities. These became topics he tackled head-on, bringing both his technical expertise and personal insight to the table. He sponsored forums at Stanford and MIT, inviting both law enforcement and community leaders to have open, often uncomfortable conversations about race, trust, and the role of emerging technology in either bridging or widening the divide. At the same time, Officer Daniel Brooks found himself navigating a different kind of terrain. Within his own department, the winds of change blew inconsistently. While some praised his efforts, others regarded him with thinly veiled disdain. The badge he wore now felt heavier, not because it symbolized shame, but because it now carried the burden of expectation. Every time he walked into a community meeting or training session, he was met with eyes that looked for proof. Proof that his transformation was real, that his apology wasn't performative, that his newfound voice wasn't a temporary shift brought on by guilt. Daniel understood the suspicion. He welcomed it. In fact, he began each session by naming it. "You don't have to trust me because I said sorry. That's not how trust works. You have to see me work for it. Every day. That's what this is about." And he did work. Tirelessly. He studied cultural psychology and trauma-informed policing practices. He read the histories of systemic injustice that had never been part of his academy training. He began weekly meetings with young officers, encouraging them to speak about their fears and biases without shame, not to excuse them, but to expose them before they shaped action. One night, after a long town hall meeting in Oakland, a young activist approached him outside the community center. She was skeptical, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "Do you really think one apology makes a difference?" she asked. Daniel looked at her, the shadows of streetlights cutting across his tired face. "No," he said softly, "but one decision can lead to another. One moment can change the way we show up for the next one. I'm not here because I got it right. I'm here because I got it wrong and decided that wasn't where the story should end." Word of Daniel's quiet determination began to spread. He was invited to join a state-level advisory board on police ethics and training reform. There, in a room filled with politicians, professors, and civil rights leaders, he spoke not as an expert, but as someone willing to unlearn, to confront the institutional silence that had allowed unchecked assumptions to masquerade as protocol. And while many applauded his honesty, others pushed back hard. Unions challenged his rising visibility. Some accused him of virtue signaling. Others claimed he was eroding public trust in law enforcement. But Daniel stood firm, not out of pride, but out of purpose. During this time, Sundar and Daniel remained in occasional contact, not in the grand, dramatic way media might portray, but in simple, meaningful exchanges. A thoughtful email here, a phone call after a speaking engagement. They had become unlikely allies, bound not by ideology, but by experience. Two men from vastly different worlds who had collided in a moment of tension, and instead of walking away, had chosen to engage. That bond was tested one day when a national news network invited both of them to appear on a televised debate titled, "Reform or Resistance? Is Policing in America Beyond Repair?" The title itself was loaded, and both men knew the danger of being framed into oppositional corners. They discussed it privately. "I don't want to be a prop," Sundar said. "Nor a token," Daniel added. But after careful thought, they agreed, not to debate, but to show what a conversation could look like when two people refused to be enemies. The segment aired live and was unlike anything the network had hosted before. No shouting. No posturing. Just two men sitting across from each other, speaking with clarity, humility, and honesty. Sundar spoke about dignity, access, and the subtle violence of being doubted for simply existing in certain spaces. Daniel spoke about legacy, silence, and the fear officers carried. Fear that sometimes distorted into aggression. Fear that went unspoken because masculinity was taught to silence vulnerability. The moderator, clearly expecting fireworks, found himself instead witnessing a masterclass in emotional intelligence. By the end of the segment, social media exploded, not with rage, but with relief. Viewers commented, "This is what leadership looks like." Finally, a conversation instead of a confrontation. More of this, please. That night, after the cameras stopped rolling, Daniel and Sundar shook hands quietly backstage. There was no need for grand declarations. They had done what they came to do, not to win, but to witness each other's humanity. But the road ahead was far from easy. In the following weeks, threats and criticism increased. Anonymous letters arrived at Daniel's station. Some accused him of betraying the badge. Others threatened his safety. At home, his wife worried constantly. "Are you sure this is worth it?" she asked one night, tears brimming in her eyes. He held her hand, looked into her worried gaze, and whispered, "If I back down now, what message does that send to every kid who thinks this system won't ever see them? I have to keep going. We both do." And so he did. And so did Sundar. Because somewhere along the line, they had stopped reacting to a single incident and started responding to a deeper call. A call to show the world that growth was possible, that reflection was power, and that empathy, when practiced not as a gesture but a discipline, could be the most disruptive force in any broken system. Fires in the quiet. As summer unfolded across the American landscape, thick with sun and unrest, the paths of Officer Daniel Brooks and Sundar Pichai began to test not just their resolve, but their identities. They had each stepped willingly into the current of national dialogue, but neither had expected the waters to rise so quickly or with such force. What began as a quiet moral decision, a moment of honesty, an act of grace, had now grown into a narrative larger than either of them. And with that size came consequences that no interview could soften. For Daniel, the pressure began to seep into his personal life, curling like smoke under doors that had once offered refuge. He had always believed that integrity would shield him, that owning his mistake and doing the work to improve would create admiration, or at the very least, understanding. But now he saw how uncomfortable truth made people, especially when it knocked at the door of institutions built on silence. His precinct had grown colder in tone. His fellow officers, once casual and brotherly, now treated him with polite caution, the way one might handle a live wire. His supervisors couldn't openly reprimand him, but they found other ways to signal their discontent. He was pulled from outreach programs, reassigned to administrative duties, and rarely briefed on high-level meetings anymore. He tried to tell himself it was temporary. That discomfort was a natural part of growth. But it wasn't the professional alienation that hurt the most. It was the slow erosion of personal ties. Friends stopped calling. Barbecue invites stopped coming. Even some of the men he had mentored, young officers who once looked up to him, began to pull away, afraid his name might stain theirs. His wife, Rachel, noticed the change before he did. At first, she tried to hold it together, organizing quiet evenings at home, shielding their son from the growing tension. But soon, she too began to buckle under the strain. I feel like we're alone in this," she admitted one night, as they sat at the kitchen table, their dinner barely touched. Daniel looked at her, exhaustion pressed deep into the lines around his eyes. "We are," he said quietly. "But maybe that's what change looks like at first. Lonely. Unwelcome. But necessary." Rachel didn't answer. She only reached for his hand. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew the cost of truth was heavier than they had anticipated. At the same time, thousands of miles away, Sundar was facing a different kind of weight. As his voice became increasingly influential in discussions of ethical technology and social leadership, the world began to see him less as a man and more as a symbol. In boardrooms, his name was invoked as shorthand for diversity. At universities, he was hailed as a model immigrant success story. On news panels, he was the calm voice of reason who had handled injustice with grace. But with each layer of admiration came expectation, the demand that he always be composed, always be the bridge, always be the perfect representative of a narrative he didn't fully choose. He began receiving invitations from global organizations, human rights groups, even the United Nations. Some wanted him to speak on equity in tech, others on race and class in corporate spaces. At first, he embraced the opportunities. He saw them as extensions of the same belief that had fueled his journey, that progress required action and silence was complicity. But soon, he realized the toll of constantly being on. Every word he said was analyzed, every pause interpreted. He no longer had the freedom to simply exist. He had become a vessel for meaning. And sometimes, the burden of meaning eclipsed the man behind it. At home, his children began to notice his absence, not just physical, but emotional. His daughter, just entering her teenage years, asked him one morning before school, "Why do people want you to fix everything?" The question, so innocent and so piercing, stayed with him long after she left. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window into the quiet sprawl of Silicon Valley. He remembered being that young boy in Chennai, waiting for buses in the heat, dreaming not of fame or influence, but simply of opportunity. And now he had all the opportunity in the world, yet felt strangely caged by it. That internal conflict came to a head when he was asked to deliver the keynote at a global summit on justice and innovation. The event would be streamed to millions. Leaders from every continent would be watching. It was, by all metrics, a defining moment. But Sundar hesitated, not because he lacked something to say, but because he questioned whether the stage had become a distraction from the quiet, grounded work that change truly required. He reached out to Daniel, who by now had become more than just a name in a news story. He had become a kind of mirror, someone who understood the difference between doing the right thing and being paraded as the right kind of person. They met one afternoon at a quiet park halfway between their cities. There were no press, no handlers, no audiences. Just two men sitting on a bench, shaded by a tree whose roots had long outlived them both. Sundar spoke first. "I think I'm losing sight of what I'm trying to change," he confessed. "Every time I speak, it feels like performance. But if I stop, I wonder if I'm wasting a chance to help." Daniel nodded, his voice low and tired. "I know what you mean. People either hate what you're doing or worship it. Neither sees who you really are." They sat in silence for a moment, the wind carrying the sound of children playing in the distance. "You ever think about quitting?" Sundar asked. Daniel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both pain and clarity. "Every day. But then I think about what quitting would say to the kid watching. The one who's never been believed, or the one who's never been questioned and needs to be." Sundar looked away, blinking against the sunlight. "Maybe we keep going, but we choose how." That conversation marked a turning point. They decided, independently and yet in sync, to recalibrate, to shed the weight of performance and return to purpose. Sundar began investing more in long-term community programs, ones that didn't make headlines but built tangible outcomes. He funded a network of tech labs in underserved communities, each one co-designed with local youth. He refused some of the larger media appearances, choosing instead to hold private forums with young leaders where he could speak freely without the pressure of optics. Daniel, meanwhile, submitted a request for a departmental reassignment, not to avoid conflict, but to return to patrol in the neighborhoods where trust had eroded most. He wanted to walk the streets again, not as a savior, but as a student. "Let me earn my place back," he wrote in the memo. "Not through policy, through presence." It was an unusual request, one that sparked debate among his superiors, but eventually it was granted, and with it came new challenges, but also new moments of grace. In the streets, people recognized him. Some stared, some avoided him, but others approached, cautiously, curiously. One day, an elderly man who ran a corner shop extended a bottle of water and said, "I saw you on the news. Didn't think much of it at first, but you came back. That counts." The road ahead remained uncertain. Both men knew the nature of public memory was fickle. Today's heroes could be tomorrow's targets, but they also knew something deeper. That real change wasn't made in headlines, or speeches, or viral moments. It was made in the choice to show up, again and again, even when it hurt, even when it was thankless. Because somewhere out there, someone was watching. Someone who had been silenced, overlooked, or misjudged. And maybe, just maybe, seeing two men take responsibility, stay humble, and keep moving forward, that might give them the courage to do the same.